It's Thursday, January 15th, 2026, and you're listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a podcast devoted to the discussion of policy research from the Hoover Institution and issues of geopolitical, national, and local concern. I'm Jonathan Mavroidis, and every month I have the privilege of moderating a discussion on politics and the economic situation of the Golden State with two Hoover Fellows and experts on these issues, Bill Whalen and Lee Ohanian. Bill Whalen is the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism and the regular host of the show. And Lee Ohanian is a Hoover Senior Fellow and Professor of Economics at the University of California, Los Angeles. Both write for Hoover's web channel, California on Your Mind. Good day, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Doing well, folks.
Hey, fellas. Good to see you.
Good to see you and Happy New Year. California's legislature is back, and Governor Newsom has returned to the Capitol for the first in-person State of the State in decades. And this is framed around honoring California's past and promising future. The speech leaned heavily on familiar themes: democracy under threat, economic strength, declining homelessness, and rising education funding. The LA Times called it a notably rosy portrait. Newsom also defended high-speed rail and floated a late-term power shift away from the superintendent of public instruction, and once again positioned California as a national model, raising questions about governance, priorities, and presidential politics. Bill, is it smart politics for Newsom to offer California as a model for the nation?
In a word, no. If he's going to get elected president of the United States in 2028, the assumption being that he will leave office in January 2027 and quickly pivot to a national campaign if he's not running already, he is not going to get elected president of the United States based upon the public perception of California or his record in California. Governors have learned this the hard way. Bill Clinton did not run very hard on Arkansas. Michael Dukakis got bogged down by Massachusetts when he ran. So, no, but that said, Newsom has to defend California. You cannot stand in front of the legislature and not tout all that you're doing. It's just part of speech writing 101. A couple of thoughts about this address. It was given at the very beginning of January. Congratulations, Governor Newsom. This is what governors historically have done. I worked for Pete Wilson when he was the governor of the 90s. I was his chief speechwriter his second term, collaborated on such speeches. And we went in early January for two reasons. One, a Republican governor having to deal with the Democratic legislature, so kind of going into hostile territory. We felt it was important to give a speech and frame what the governor wanted to do before we had to play defense 1,001 times with the legislature for the next few months. Secondly, Wilson was one of about 30 plus Republican governors at the time, all pretty much saying the same thing, be it lower taxes, welfare reform, tougher crime laws, class size reduction. You all remember the greatest hits of the 90s. So we wanted to kind of get the jump on that. An hour and 5 minute speech by Newsom, and the LA Times is absolutely right. It was very rosy. I want to get Lee's thoughts on this. But I think what this was, and I'm going to be very cynical here for a moment. If indeed Newsom is running for president, this was a very effective political speech in this regard, not because he necessarily is dealing with a lot of realistic problems in California, such as high-speed rail, not that necessarily he's promoting a broader future because there are a lot of problems, including the budget, which we'll get to in a few minutes, but because you can take this speech and just kind of strip it down into its parts. There are a dozen and one little 1 and 2 minute snippets in this speech that you can post on social media. You can put on X, you can put on your own account for the governor, you can put it on Blue Sky, and it all speaks very well to running for president, be it those snippets where he's bashing the president, where he's talking about investing in California education, where he's talking about not standing down to the unnamed conservative bullies and so forth. So very politically effective in that regard. But Lee, there is the problem about what exactly the governor is proposing policy-wise, and if indeed he is living in the court of reality.
Yeah, Bill. Yeah, it's reality for him, I guess. I mean, he seems very sincere about the issues he spoke about in his State of the State address. Bill, you know what I found interesting about this is that this is the first time in how many years? 3 years? Since he has actually given the State of the State at the time of the calendar year when the State of the State is given, and that he did it in front of the legislature.
Last time he went in front of the legislature was in 2020, right before the pandemic, and he's never done one this early in January. Usually he's done them in February, and the governor's office will say, well, the governor has a problem with dyslexia. Doing big speeches is problematic, so that's why he's not keen on doing this so much. So this was a departure for him, both going back to the legislature and doing it this early.
Right. And it's hard not to think that this is really just about politics and about his about his position himself as a 2028 candidate. It's also the case that the state of the state, I think he has given those as late as summer, perhaps even late summer.
September. Last year, Lee, a letter to the legislature in September.
A letter to the legislature in September. So, so here we are with the governor. We are all thinking he'll be running for the Democratic nomination in 2028. So now he's doing it in January. He's doing it in front of the Senate. Bill, he spoke about housing and homelessness, and he needs to address those topics because those were really the pinnacle of his campaign way back in 2018. He talked about a Marshall Plan for housing, and of course, referring to the enormous rebuilding of Western Europe after World War II. And he talked about 3.5, I believe the number was 3.5 million new housing units by last year.
Right.
I don't know the exact number, but I think we got, I think we're only about 20% of what he promised. Now, forget about promise, but 20% is about where we were before he took office.
Right.
So what we're looking at is it's as if he had said nothing about housing.
Right.
And in the time that he has been governor, the price of the median California single-family home has jumped to about $900,000.
Right.
Affordability based on California's demographic income, I think it's around 20%, maybe 20 or 25% of California can afford that median priced home. And that assumes that the buyer has 20% down.
Right.
Good luck if you're a renter and you've got 180,000 plus other closing costs to purchase that home.
Yeah.
So housing, he's extremely vulnerable on housing. And at the same time, we pass all these housing bills since he's become governor, and none of them have moved the needle. And there's, and the 800-pound gorilla in the room about why housing hasn't increased is because it is extremely expensive to build housing in California. In areas such as San Francisco, I don't know, $700 a square foot. In Los Angeles, $500 a square foot. So you're looking at $500,000 to $700,000, 1,000 square foot units. And relatively few people can afford those. And if you can, why not live in a state where 500,000 to 700,000 buys you a mansion?
So let's don't go deeper into housing because I want to talk more about that later in the podcast, Lee. But here are two things that stuck out to me as I've listened to this speech. One is I think high-speed rail has now officially become indefensible in California in this regard. The governor tried to talk about progress, but he didn't talk about miles of track being laid. He just talked about building up to laying down track. And Lee, this was something that Californians first voted on in 2008. So here we are 17 years later, and we still don't have track to talk about. But here's where I think it's become indefensible. Rather than talking about the viability of the system, the economic importance of it, he just said words to the effect that, if you make fun of the high-speed rail in California, you're making fun of the good people of the Central Valley who will be riding this thing. And so that's just kind of the weakest excuse. But what really caught my attention, Lee, here as a propeller head kind of guy, the governor wants to fiddle around with the structure of government. And this is something long overdue in California. What he wants to do specifically, Lee and Jonathan, is he wants to take power from the superintendent of public instruction, an elected official. He wants to have the State Board of Education, which is an 11-member body appointed by the governor, and have them take charge of the California part of education, leaving the SPI with a broader responsibility for what the governor called, quote, foster coordination and alignment of state education policies. Lee, I think this is a great idea. I don't understand why California has a superintendent of public instruction, why we just don't have an education secretary, much less a body appointed by the governor. But I think this opens a window, Lee, to a lot of governor reorg that if I could play Mad Hatter in Sacramento, that I'd do. But what do you think about streamlining education, Lee?
Well, there's certainly a lot of redundancies within state government. The organizational structure hasn't changed for an awful long time in terms of its bones. So that organizational structure came from a different time, different needs, different economy. Bill, if I dig down into this a little bit, I'm really worried. The biggest reason is because our educational outcomes, in my opinion, are just so remarkably deficient.
Mhm.
Roughly 1 out of 4 kids are proficient at federal standards in math and within California public education. And that's just unacceptable. The federal bar for proficiency is not particularly high. Only about 1 in 3, even less than that, are proficient in reading at federal proficient levels. So these are the individuals who are going to inherit the California economy in
Right.
10. And so you can't have people who are not basically proficient in math and communication skills running the state. What worries me a little bit about state superintendent is that is a politically accountable position. If you don't do a good job, voters can vote you out. I worry about a politically appointed board. But on the other hand, Tony Thurmond, this is really a shot at Tony Thurmond, who has been state superintendent for an awful long time. He just hasn't been effective.
Right.
His effectiveness has been so low that I don't think he was even invited to the governor's press conference when he reopened schools from COVID. What is unfortunate for Californians is that when Thurmond was elected in 2018, there was another Democrat, Marshall Tuck, who ran. The vote was extremely close, something like 49.5 to 50.5. Tuck had a record of rapidly turning around the worst schools in California, going from kids who were completely unmotivated, who were not ready to go to college, who basically weren't even graduating,
Mhm.
if we want to be honest about it, from high school, into high-performing schools. There was a guy who could have completely turned around California education. The party machine backed Tony Thurmond. He won, and now we're looking at what's happened over the last years and saying, oh, you know what? Let's just get rid of the office because it's not doing anything.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. I vote to remove the office because the SPI gives his or her own version of the state in terms of education, which nobody pays attention to. They're not really much of a force when it comes to doing legislation. They spend the year doing a lot of photo ops in schools. It's just we don't need to spend that money in that office. So consolidate it and put it under the governor's wing and let the chisme go. But I would open the door here to other government reorgs here, Lee and Jonathan. We have a treasurer and a controller in California. I don't see why you can't merge the two offices and have one person do the two functions. The controller oversees spending in California. The treasurer basically sells bonds on Wall Street. One person can do those jobs. I would abolish lieutenant governor's office. Either abolish it or I'd pair it with the governor. So you run somebody on a ticket because what history shows you is lieutenant governors are usually isolated. Governors don't want to share stuff with the office. The LG just sits there waiting for something to happen to the governor, which doesn't. You saw this with Lady Kounalakis this time around when she decided to run for governor, but couldn't crack 2 or 3% in the polls because she just doesn't have much to show in a way of records. So I'd probably ditch that office. And then the third one I would do, Lee, is I'd get rid of the insurance commissioner, make it an appointee of the guy. If you want to have an office, just have a gubernatorial appointee. And here's the problem: the idea with like SPIs, you're going to have a watchdog office. The insurance commissioner is going to watch over the industry. We have seen with recent insurance commissioners, this is a problematic relationship.
Hey, Bill, what we live in what should be the most technologically advanced state in the country with Silicon Valley. Just think about how many functions within state government could be streamlined using AI. You mentioned some. It's really hard to argue that the controller and the treasurer should be two different people. And the insurance commissioner, oh my God, that has just been a disaster within the state. It is so hard to buy homeowners insurance now. What you can buy is as a homeowner who lost my home insurance, and then I had to find new home insurance that was about 60% more expensive. This is happening everywhere within California. And Ricardo Lara, who is the insurance commissioner, he was in the news recently about very expensive trips he was taking
Right.
in his role as insurance commissioner. Home insurance has got to be fixed. It hasn't been. I mean, it's just as simple as that. So that has been an enormous problem within California.
You know, the year last column for California Your Mind last year was titled Another Year of Bad Governance. I'm just curious, as we're beginning 2026, the governor's given his big speech. The legislature is starting to move on bills, one of which I want to talk about in a few minutes. What are you using as parameters in 2026 for bad versus good governance? Are you looking at a certain issue or a certain bill? How are you going to judge good versus bad?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's just so many areas you can point to.
Mhm.
Education, transportation. Bill, you mentioned high-speed rail and what a fiasco that has become. You mentioned it was indefensible. I totally agree with that. And again, not to pile on the governor, but in his first State of the State address, or actually, I believe this is his inaugural address many years ago, he talked about how high-speed rail connecting LA to San Francisco, which was the dream that was sold to us as voters when we approved a
Right.
nearly $10 billion bond. He said that's just not realistic. That's when he could have simply said, well, we have other priorities, and we don't have endless revenue. We are going to put this, we're going to put this on ice for a while.
Instead, he spent 24 hours doing damage control, saying, "No, I'm not killing the project. Here's what I meant to say."
Yeah, and building Bakersfield to Merced
Right.
that might be ready in 7 to 9 years at a cost of about $35 billion, which no one believes is economically reasonable without the rest of the system. And there is no path forward for another $100 billion to build the rest of the system. So I think the governor made a mistake back then. But in terms of but we're not going to see, high-speed rail is not going to get any better. It's going to submit a lot more money. It's going to move forward at a snail's pace. I think a lot of people would love to see some type of productive vision about homelessness. We've spent tens of billions of dollars, and it has gotten worse. Now, the governor talked about how there was a 9% reduction, and he was crowing about that. He said, look at California. We're a model for the rest of the country. Some other states are doing worse in homelessness. We got 9% better. Well, there's an important asterisk next to that, which is that not all communities of care, which are the regions that count the homelessness, not all of them, I don't believe all of them have reported that the number 9% reduction, I believe, is based on an incomplete count. I may be wrong about that, but I believe it's based on incomplete count, an account that appears to be too low. The RAND Corporation was a nonpartisan research organization in the Los Angeles area, wrote a very detailed report talking about just how much of an undercount is occurring in LA and LA County. The Legislative Analyst's Office has, based on medical records, has identified perhaps as many as 300,000 unhoused within California, which is much, much higher than the official count. So I think we need a complete redo on a framework for homelessness, which in my opinion is enormous expansion of the ability to put these people into inpatient psychiatric treatment. You get them off the streets. You put them on the path to a better life, and people living in San Francisco, West LA, San Diego, other areas with enormous amounts of homelessness. That's an improvement for everyone. So that's what I would love to see. I don't expect to see that. So Bill, I expect 2026 to look a lot like 2025. Hopefully, we don't waste as much money as we did in 2025.
Simple exercise for journalists out there. Maybe you and I can do this in our column writing as well, Lee. The governor's going to talk about year versus year. And so when he talks about homelessness being down, that's a very convenient way to do it. I think an enterprising reporter or somebody like us with time on our hands to write about this, we need to go back to 2019 and say, here's what the governor inherited, and here's what he's leaving California with. So what was the homeless population in 2019? Where is the homeless population today? And how much money have you spent on homelessness over that period of time? And just do that on issue after issue, because to put it in presidential terms, are you better off after 8 years of Gavin Newsom than you were before? So that's how I'd approach it. But one problem with this governor is going to be, and we can segue here, Jonathan, is the budget, which he had a little surprising news in his State of the State, but there's a long-term problem here. But Jonathan, go ahead and tee us up.
Yeah, in his address, Governor Newsom unveiled what he framed as a fiscal escape hatch, an additional 42 billion in general fund revenue over 3 years,
Right.
which is driven largely by high-tech salaries and AI-related gains. That windfall, he claims, reduces what had been projected to be an $18 billion deficit next year to a $2.9 billion shortfall, pending the May revise. Newsom's budget now stands at 348.9 billion, nearly triple Florida's $117 billion budget, and far above California's $321 billion current budget. When Newsom took office in 2019, that budget was 214.8 billion. These assumptions are contested, while the Department of Finance is betting that the AI-driven stock boom will continue. The nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office projects a $35 billion shortfall over the next 3 fiscal years, warning that current AI era revenue growth is unlikely to persist. Gentlemen, what are the pros and cons of being so dependent on AI growth? Is there soon going to be an AI bubble, even if AI accelerates productivity while displacing jobs outside the tech sector? Does that ultimately undermine the state's broader revenue base? Lee?
I'll let the economist answer the AI question, but let me just add a little bit more to this. The $42 billion surprise. Yes, it's from AI. Yes, it's from tech workers. Also, the governor's bean counters did something in retrospect is very clever. They kind of factored in a worst case scenario for Trump and tariffs affecting California. And so they anticipated far less revenue. It's turned out the tariff situation has not been as devastating to California's economy as naysayers suggested. So that also attributed to the windfall. But here's the problem. I worked in state government. I can tell you that every governor plays fast and loose with the state budget. You put your thumb on it. Back in the 90s when I was involved in this sort of stuff, we'd always anticipate a few billion dollars from Washington to counter illegal immigration, which we knew wouldn't be there, but we'd say it was coming anyway for the sake of balancing our budget. So here you have a supposed $3 billion shortfall, but it's the ominous warning from the LAO's office saying, in effect, the AI bubble can't continue. So, Lee, this is kind of the question at the hour in California. Back in the 90s, the California economy was driven by trade, tourism, and this emerging thing called technology. Well, now we have technology as a very dominant part of the California economic landscape, and AI in particular. But AI strikes me as problematically. It is the future, obviously. It also takes away jobs, doesn't it? So I think it has all kinds of economic impact.
Yeah, Bill, California is is somewhat unique in how it funds government. It relies enormously on personal income taxes, and among those personal income tax collections, and a huge amount comes from the top 1%, from really the top one half of 1%. So Bill Whalen is an enterprising startup. He's a tech genius. He starts an AI company. We do an IPO. Billionaire overnight. The state benefits from a revenue windfall from that IPO, but from the income realized from that. So that's what the state is thinking about. We have had these revenue roller coasters, for as long as we can remember. When the stock market does well, cash flows in, and that's what we're seeing right now. Cash has gone into Sacramento, partially because of the stock market. The state finance department, Bill, as you noted, is thinking that's going to continue. So there's two budgets out there right now. There's one coming from the governor, and then there's an evaluation of that from the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office. And they're really, really quite different. And this is very concerning because the Legislative Analyst's Office called the budget projection alarming. I cannot remember when they have ever used that type of language. They're typically very conservative, plain vanilla. They do not use those kind of words. I've never seen the word alarming. And here's where it really bites. We are in fiscal year 25-26. The budget we're looking at right now, which is the governor's calling for close to $350 billion.
Yep.
That is nearly a 75% increase since the governor took office. Jerry Brown's last budget, I believe, was around $200 billion, and the governor is now proposing a $350 billion debt.
It's actually the numbers are actually, Lee. It's so Newsom walked in. The first Newsom budget was 214.8. And if this one goes through, it'll be 348.9. So it'd be 62% by my math.
Yeah.
But here's what kind of drives me nuts about the coverage of the budget. For all the agonizing over the $2.9 billion shortfall, when you go, my math is crude here, but if you go from 321 billion to almost 350, it's about an 8 to 9% increase in spending. So you're just talking about slowing the increase of spending.
Yeah, and Bill, where this becomes really problematic, the LAO, their projection
Right.
is that the state's reserves. So we have this thing, this euphemistically called the rainy day fund that's supposed to be for emergencies.
Right.
The LAO projects we will essentially be out of reserves, which is the ability to absorb economic shocks and continue to pay for programs when revenues are unexpectedly low. They're expecting we're going to be essentially out of revenues in about a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Lee, we had $100 billion surplus about 3 years ago. What happened?
Poof. Yeah, that surplus, over a few months went from 100 billion ostensible surplus. And then once we recognized what was going on with revenues and temporary COVID funds, we have been running just chronically on deficits every year. Again, the LAO by fiscal year 29-30 it is projecting a negative $100 billion reserve fund. That is, we will have gone in there. Not only won't have any reserves left, is projecting we'll have negative 100 billion reserves. So obviously you can't get to that. Push comes to shove. We have to spend a lot less, or we have to find a lot more revenues, according to the LAO. They are much more pessimistic than the governor.
Lee, a real interesting character who's emerging in this is Matt Mahan, the mayor of San Jose. He has been a very vocal critic of the governor when it comes to homelessness. They've clashed over that. And now if you go to the mayor's social media feed, he is all over Sacramento by de facto the governor on the budget and just calling it a house of cards, and we can't go on like this. Lee, we still have until I think March the 6th for people to announce for governor, but boy, Mayor Mahan sure sounds gubernatorial these days.
He really does, and it's very interesting because he's a Democrat and he's calling out people within his own party.
Yeah,
they've talked. He's not naming names, but it's pretty obvious who he's calling out.
right. Lee, you mentioned that the 1% in California, the one half of the 1%, really kind of carry the weight on taxes here. Jonathan, why would the state of California want to put a ballot measure up that would essentially kill the goose that lays the golden egg?
So by June, we'll know whether a proposed one-time tax on Californian resident billionaires makes the November ballot or whether it quietly disappears during the budget negotiations.
Right.
This measure, backed by the SEIU, United Healthcare Workers West, would impose a 5% tax on people with a net worth over $1 billion as of January 1st, 2026, payable over 5 years, with proceeds earmarked for healthcare, education, food assistance. Supporters of course frame it as a fairness measure, and the critics warn it would accelerate capital flight, distort startup compensation, and shrink the tax base. Some high-profile billionaires have provided negative signals, among them Peter Thiel, Larry Page, and Palmer Luckey. So I'll kick this back to you all. Lee, is there any real precedent for wealth taxes actually working, raising durable revenue without triggering avoidance, capital flight, or long-term economic damage?
Jonathan, it's interesting. A number of countries tried wealth taxes 30 to 40 years ago, including Italy and Spain, I believe Germany. They all dropped them. And the reason is because they're very expensive to implement. It requires a lot of oversight. In some cases, becomes very, very difficult to value wealth. Jonathan, you got that Picasso hanging in your living room. You're keeping your kids from throwing spitballs at it. How much is that worth? So you have to bring in appraisers to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So among those countries that tried wealth taxes, one that remains is Norway. But Norway is losing their most productive people, their wealthiest people. One individual. I believe he noted that he had paid more, I think, as much or perhaps more in Norway taxes as anyone there. Yeah, relocated to Italy. Now, the challenge within the United States is that if this did come onto the ballot and if it was passed, it would be, of course, challenged in courts. I suspect it would be found to be unconstitutional. But in any case, it's a lot easier to move within the United States than moving from one country to another. And, we're already seeing that. Bill, I have seen estimates perhaps as much as, I believe, $1 trillion
Yep.
leaving California in the form of, and these are typically tech people, those who, Larry Page, who co-founded Google, Peter Thiel, who may be relocating to Florida. So this hasn't even, so this is several months from even knowing if it's on the ballot, and you've got people moving already. So this
But
is,
you have to move already, because one of the very clever, call it insidious little provisions in this initiative is that it applies to every California billionaire who is living in the state as of January 1st, 2026. In other words, they're anticipating if the thing passed in November, the day after the election, every billionaire would pack up and go. No, so if you're already here in the state, you are trapped. So you saw this exodus late in the year, and that's the $1 trillion, which some venture capitalists say has already had. But Lee, what's interesting is you have the SEIU Healthcare Workers West pushing this thing, and as Jonathan alluded to, June is the crunch time here. It's when the budget's being settled. Maybe they could be bought off with some sort of budget deal as it pertains to healthcare spending, or it goes forward. Now, the governor has said he will fight this. We'll see how much capital he puts into fighting it, if you will. But Lee, what's interesting is I'm not sure that the left understands necessarily the world of billionaires and finance in this regard. There are some billionaires who are very rich in cash, and so if Lee Ohanian is worth $1 billion, he can write a check to $50 million to the state of California and not feel it. But for some billionaires, this is going to cause a lot of pain in terms of how they're going to come up with the 5%. You might see some people having to sell off parts of their company, and now you're getting into the very culture of your company. So this is just a very hot mess coming California's way.
yeah, the SEIU thought they were being clever by trying to, essentially backdate the tax obligation to 2025. And so you've got billionaires saying, okay, well, guess what? I'm a resident of Florida or Texas or Nevada as of January 1st, 2026. And Bill, they're, not to get into the complexities of voting shares, but the way the bill is written is that the obligation could be much higher than people expect, because people like, some of these founders will have on paper a relatively small fraction of shares outstanding, but they have controlling interest because of differences between Class A and Class B stock. So there's a clause within this proposed wealth tax that could make their tax obligation based on their controlling interest and not necessarily the number of shares they actually have. So this could just, in principle, it could bankrupt some of these people.
Right.
So I'm not surprised they're leaving. It's a terrible idea, in my opinion. And Bill, this was ruminating last year, back last summer. And I'm surprised if the governor really, if the governor wanted to keep those people in California, which we really need these people in California. They're incredibly imaginative, creative, innovative. There's only, a few dozen people like this in the entire world. We need them in California. The governor should have put the kibosh on this back last summer.
There are only about a couple hundred billionaires in California we're talking about. One other problem here, Lee, is the fiscal side of this. You're going to raise all this revenue through the tax. It's going to go into public health care programs, education programs, food assistance programs, and so forth. This is not one-time spending. This is not taking $100 billion and putting it into the high-speed rail, for example. This is going to be ongoing government spending. So what happens when you run out of that revenue? You're going to have to go back and retax the billionaires. You're going to have to tax millionaires to keep feeding the beast that is government. What are you going to do?
Well, yeah, and Bill, budgets are fungible. A dollar not spent, we can say that and of course, the message is going to be, well, this is going to be for healthcare. And this is going to be for education, but budgets are fungible. $1 in this bucket can be moved to $1 in that bucket, even if it's just implicit. So, but that's the marketing ploy used to try to draw voters in. Realistically, there's never a one-time change in California, or really any political issue. We were supposed to have a 12.3% surtax on income back around 2010. Guess what? It's still around. And this fall, we'll be voting to make it permanent, and I suspect that will go through. So this is just an awful idea. The governor should have squashed this several months ago. And I can't help but think that the reason he hasn't is that he wouldn't have gotten any political points for it if he had just kind of kept it under the radar last summer. But if he can squash it now, and we'll see how much he does, that will get him some political capital. I kept these amazing people in California. Our tax base is not depreciating. Look at this great job I did.
Yeah, so interesting times, Jonathan. So billionaires might be getting squeezed if this initiative goes through, and apparently Wall Street's to blame for California's housing woes.
Yeah, it's interesting that President Trump and Governor Newsom have found some alignment on an issue. And that issue is affordable housing. Trump is calling for bans on institutional buyers of single-family homes, and Newsom, in the State of Address, that we've been talking about, has said, "quote It's shameful that we allow private equity firms in Manhattan to become the biggest landlords in many of our cities. Over the next few weeks, we will work with the legislature to combat this monopolistic behavior, strengthen accountability, and level the playing field for working families. That means more oversight and enforcement and potentially changing the state tax code to make this work." The message is resonating. Tom Steyer, who we spoke about earlier, is now running hard against Wall Street as well, even as California continues to fall short of its own housing targets. Question: if housing is going to be a central political issue, Lee, what's the real fix?
Yeah, the real fix is to build where it's cheap to build. So a few months ago, we talked about how just the construction costs in California, including regulatory costs and other costs that go into finally moving some people into four walls and a roof, they're just enormously high. You just can't, nothing pencils out. You build you spend $500,000 to build a 1,000 square foot apartment in Los Angeles. Guess what? An awful lot of people in Los Angeles simply cannot afford that apartment. So the only solution that I see is you build where land is much less costly, and you build using manufactured and modular housing that's built in factories. That's really the only solution to California's housing crisis. Only so many people have the income to afford to be able to live in San Francisco or LA or San Diego or anywhere along the California coast. The solution is building away from the California coast. And I think it's just a nonsense to think that corporations owning housing is a bad idea. Do we want to have mom and pops running Google or GM or NVIDIA or Microsoft or IBM? No, of course not. So that's a total non sequitur in my opinion.
Lee,
Yeah.
Lee, one challenge with the modular prefab idea is actually building the modular and prefab homes, pre-building them, if you will. Californians understand doesn't right now have the capacity. Are we going to have to bring in essentially a modern day Henry Kaiser to create plants across California and start building houses?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to create new housing in California, that's what you do. The median household income in California is probably about $100,000, which means a rental payment, according to industry standards, of no more than 30% of pre-tax income goes into your monthly rent payment. That's $2,500 a month. You've got to be able to build housing that's profitable at a rent of $2,500 a month. There's simply no way to do that without building away from the coast and without being able to use mass production, which reduces costs substantially.
So let's say you do invest more in modular and prefab homes, so now you're cutting down the price of actually constructing a home, Lee, but you still have regulatory woes to deal with. So it's not like you're free from the regulatory side of it.
Yeah, you still got a lot of regulation, and communities place enormous development fees because local governments are having their own budget crises. So they see new development coming in, they say, okay, this is a revenue cash cow. So that needs to be dealt with as well. The governor, to his credit, led a change in the California Environmental Quality Act a couple of months ago, but that change, which exempts some construction from detailed CEQA reviews, is only within urban infill settings. It doesn't apply, as far as I know, to residential development in less developed settings. But those less developed settings are the ones that I'm thinking about, which is where you can build for a much lower cost. So yeah, the regulatory side still needs to be addressed substantially. Newsom, I don't think is going to do it. So that's a can that's being kicked down the road to the next governor.
So Lee, when in doubt in Sacramento, as with homelessness, spend a lot of money, and there's now talk of the legislature doing a 10 billion, that's billion with the B, $10 billion bond that crapped out last year. This, Lee, would be $7 billion for the state's multifamily housing program, which issues low-interest loans to build and maintain permanent transitional rental housing for lower-income households. $2 billion, Lee, for wildfire prevention, rental assistance, and $1 billion in low-income first-time home buyer assistance and helping with down payments. What say you to that?
Yeah, all this is just really it's barking up the wrong tree. And to see that, just go back a few decades, back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. This was a period of time where California's population almost tripled between 1940 and 1970. So just think about that, going from about, I don't know, around 6 or 7 million people to about 20 million people. That's just a huge, enormous growth. The price of California housing during that go-go period, where the population almost tripled, the change in California housing prices relative to the nation, stable.
Mhm.
It wasn't until we started piling on regulations that began with the California Environmental Quality Act around 1970. It wasn't until governments became really, really involved in the housing process that we started losing affordability. So yeah, the regulatory side is huge. And that is, everybody talks about it. But it's like the old was it Yogi Berra, everybody talks about the weather, nobody does anything about it. This is one of those issues where we can do something about it, but it's not happening.
Yeah, one thing about housing that fascinates Lee is here you have a legislature with a lot of progressive whims, but also very influenced by special interest. Let me point you to one bill in particular, AB 1157. So in January in the legislature, you have this window to quickly review bills that were killed last year and decide if you're going to bring them up again this year. So along came AB 1157, which would have lowered the statewide rent cap to 2% plus inflation. Lee, it went down. It's not going to be considered this year. Why? The California Building Association doesn't like it.
Yeah. I mean, yes, patently a bad idea. So I'm glad the state made that change.
Right.
I believe LA County implemented something very similar to this recently, and it's a terrible idea because what it means is that a landlord's costs are going to be rising at the rate of inflation. Perhaps higher, perhaps lower, but there's going to be raising at the rate of inflation, but rent costs are going to be held down. So you're going to get to a point where rental housing is unprofitable, and once rental housing becomes unprofitable, you're not going to see any more rental housing. So this is kind of a Band-Aid. This is a Band-Aid measure that's going to make housing affordability, rental affordability worse down the road. So I'm glad the state made this decision. LA County wasn't quite as sensible on this.
This is shaping up as a really interesting ballot for November potentially, in that you have progressive red meat in the form of the billionaire tax, progressive red meat in the form of the $10 billion housing bond. The legislature goes down that road, but then you'll have conservative red meat in the form of voter ID on the ballot finally in California. So, be fascinating to watch how it affects turnout on both sides.
Gentlemen, I'd like to close out this episode about looking at Iran from the mounting pressure against the Republic of Iran from the people who are protesting against that regime, as well as the crackdown, the violent crackdown from the regime on its own people. California is home to, I think, the largest population of Iranians outside Iran, many of them who fled in immigration waves after the 1979 Islamic Revolution there. Gentlemen, could you reflect on what this group has meant to the Golden State? If I recall correctly, I think the highest concentration of Iranian-Americans are in the Los Angeles area, Lee.
Yeah, that's right. Many are around the Beverly Hills area in West Los Angeles. It's a demographic that tends to be really quite wealthy, very, very productive, very entrepreneurial. A large fraction, it's interesting, a large fraction are Jewish. So they left many years ago. So it's an economically powerful and very productive group. And there's no love lost among that group for the very repressive and oppressive regime that you see now in Iran. And when you talk to these folks, they never refer to as Iran; they refer to as Persia, which of course is the historical name for that area. So these are people that I think would love to see a regime change.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you go to the corner of Westwood Boulevard and Wilkins Avenue in Los Angeles, the city is called it Persian Square. There are all kinds of nicknames for this part of Los Angeles: Little Iran, Little Persia, Tehranulus, one of my favorites here. But a couple observations here. Number one, this is the story of California, in that people come here from other parts of the world, escaping oppression, and they find opportunity and a better life in California. The Iranians get overlooked. There was this horrible show on Bravo several years ago called Shaws of Sunset, and it profiled filthy rich Iranian-Americans living very dysfunctional lives in Southern California. And basically, it did for the Iranian community what the Kardashians did for the Armenian community. But the Armenians also another example of people who escaped, in their case, a genocide and came to Southern California and found a better life. But what stands out is this. I walk most days to my office at the Hoover Institution, which means I walk across the Stanford campus, and you see nary a peep about this on the Stanford campus right now, whereas last year with Israel and Palestine and Gaza, you had encampments and people protesting all the way to the point of vandalism occurring in the president's office. But the students at Stanford don't seem to be much moved by the atrocities in Iran. And Lee, I imagine it's much the same down in UCLA. There were public protests in downtown Los Angeles, let's point that out, but still, it's just the relative silence on college campuses that I find astounding.
Yeah, there does seem to be a double standard. When it comes to Gaza, that's the easiest sell in the world to the progressive left. But when it comes to what's going on in Iran, what's going on in Africa, places like the Congo and the Sudan, Nigeria, where many Christians have been killed, there's nary a peep. That is just completely off their radar screens, and I just don't know what you'd have to do to get it on their radar screens.
Yeah. Final note on this: Reza Pahlavi, the former crown prince of Iran, the son of the deposed Shah, he may go back to Iran. He may try to lead some transition to democracy. He is a Californian. I think he has, Lee, a degree from USC that he picked up along the way. There might be a role for the Hoover Institution here. Maybe we should close with this, and that we have people like Larry Diamond who are very active in democracy at Hoover. He'd be a good voice to help the Iranians. He did this with the Iraqis after the 2003 invasion. We have economists who could help Iran figure out how to rebuild an economy and have a market-based economy. So I think there's a role for think tanks like us in helping a country like Iran get back on its feet if indeed that regime falls.
Yeah, I mean the Hoover Institution has been around now over 100 years, and
Right.
it was founded on the principle of establishing peace.
Mhm.
So it would be in the Hoover's historical wheelhouse.
Okay. Well, I'll see you at Tehran, Lee.
Bill, not so soon.
Okay.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Happy New Year, and look forward to touching base next month.
Okay. Take care, guys.
Thanks, fellas.
You've been listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a podcast of the Hoover Institution. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you might hear it. Also get alerted to new episodes of the show and the latest articles at California on Your Mind from Bill and Lee by signing up for the Hoover Daily Report at hoover.org/HDR. That's hoover.org/HDR. I'm Jonathan Fortis, sitting in for Bill Whalen, moderating, who will be back for another episode of Matters of Policy and Politics next week. Thank you for listening.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.